Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about the Transformers. But before we get into that, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love to hear from you guys. We've got an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, having said all that, let's get into it. The prologue for today's story takes place in the Earth K dimension in the year 2025, when Megatron and Galvatron have finally been defeated and the Cybertronian Civil War has finally come to an end. Optimus Prime and several other Transformers have journeyed into the depths of Cybertron to Vector Sigma, which is a huge supercomputer which breathed life into countless Transformers before them. Optimus takes the matrix of leadership out of his chest and he places it into a slot in Vector Sigma, kind of using it like a key. And then he asks Vector Sigma to give these new Transformers personality, let them think for themselves, let them grow in knowledge and wisdom, let them always value freedom, that sort of thing, right? And so with that, Vector Sigma brings each new Transformer to life. And we made a point of saying that in the past, Vector Sigma has breathed life into not only Autobots, but also Decepticons. So when it comes to these new Transformers, which are called protoforms, some of them have glowing blue eyes and some of them have red eyes. And one of the ones with red eyes is the one featured here in the channel art for this episode of our podcast. And his name is Warhawk. And he was an original character created by one of our players named Brad Williams. And as soon as he comes online, he wants to learn how to use weapons, which I thought was interesting because these new Transformers were supposed to be the first generation sort of designed for a post war society, right? For peacetime. And so Warhawk, immediately having aggressive instincts, goes completely against the grain of that. So he and the other newly created Cybertronians are taken to a medical facility where former Autobots like Ratchet and First Aid check out the new guys to make sure they're okay, right? And Warhawk's aggression is kind of noted in this scene. Also, here, by the way, is a former Decepticon that is also an original character, and his name was Hog Wild. And he was played by my son, and he was addicted to a substance called nucleon. And this is a performance enhancing fuel source that turns a transformer into what we would refer to as an action master. So that means that their systems are overclocked. It burns out their transformation cogs so they don't have an alt mode anymore. But it makes them stronger, faster, so on and so forth. Kind of a funny running gag through the game was my son watched the old Action Master commercials from the 80s, and he was using kind of the sound bites and the taglines from those commercials, but he was saying it as if his character was like on cocaine, right? And so he had this manic energy and he was very high energy for the whole game and kind of jittery. And he's like, I've never felt more alive. And that's a quote from one of those old commercials. So that was kind of funny, right? There was a lot of sort of deep cuts for fans of the original Transformers. So at any rate, while Ratchet tends to hog Wild's various medical problems that he has from being on Nucleon, whenever Ratchet turns his back, Hog Wild steals anything he can, right? And then after that scene, Hog Wild goes to a former Decepticon named Swindle, who is kind of a black market, shady criminal type, right? And so Hog Wild trades the stolen goods for another hit of Nucleon. And he doesn't get as much as he'd hoped for, as Swindle is slowly raising the price. Swindle then tells Hog Wild that he has another contact who has been asking for cloning equipment. So if Hog Wild can steal that, Swindle will give him 10 doses of Nucleon. Hog Wild agrees, and then he decides he's going to go back to the medical center late that night, in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, Warhawk flies to Earth to the west coast of the United States, where Sideswipe and Sunstreaker have a nightclub. Here he hangs out with Bunker Buster, who was Scott Horner's PC, Hummer, who was Howard Warren's PC, Monkey Wrench, who's Kelson Barber's PC, Grench, who is John Boggs' PC, and Tinker, who is my wife's PC. And then also, aside from the player characters, there are also some non-player characters here. So one of them was Adamant, who we said was the son of Ironhide and Chromia. And I know me mentioning kids is going to be a controversial thing to say, that there's a lot of Transformers fans with a lot of differing opinions on all that. I had a book when I was young about Wheelie, and the book specifically mentioned Wheelie's parents. It came out the same year as Transformers the movie in 1986, and it said Wheelie and his parents had crash landed on the planet of the Quintessons, and his parents had died, unfortunately. And so Wheelie was almost like a Tarzan kind of a figure, being raised in the wild of Quintessa, having to deal with Sharkticons and all manner of dangerous stuff. So I had just always taken that to heart my entire life. Um, and Sideswipe and Sunstreaker, who we just mentioned that own the nightclub, they refer to each other as brothers. Even in Beast Wars, I believe there was a character named Optimus Minor, who on the tech specs it said he was the son of Optimus Primal. So I've always thought that those family relationships have been there the whole time. And I know a lot of fans are not going to like that we did that, but at the end of the day, it's my game, right? That's how I do it. I kind of say that the female Autobots have kind of a cyber womb, like we hear them on Transformers Prime talking about uh CNA, which is their version of DNA. And to me, that also implies that it's passed on, right? And being a big Star Trek fan, Star Trek has replicators that can make, you know, anything you need, really. So in my mind, that's something along those lines is what the female Autobots are doing, kind of off screen, and we've just never seen it. So in the game, that's how it works, in my game, in the dimension that we call Earth K. So yeah, going back to the list, Adamant is then the son of Ironhide and Chromia. Barnstormer is um, the child of Powerglide and Moonracer. Bellis, which is Latin for beautiful, by the way, not only beautiful in terms of physically, but also in terms of personality. Just a very universal compliment kind of a thing. She's the daughter of Optimus Prime and Elita One, which, by the way, which Adamant was teasing her and calling her princess, and she was sort of annoyed by that. I thought that was kind of cool. Ichiban, who we mentioned all the way back when we did the Crisis on Infinite Earths in the mid 80s, his dad was Shattered Glass Megatron, and then his mother was Shattered Glass Mega Empress. And then he had left that dimension when it was destroyed by the antimatter wave that was a result of the anti-monitor, right? That was the main villain of that storyline. He came to Earth K from that other dimension. So he has now grown up and he kind of looks like Megatron, but he's got a lot of white on him. He's got like a black helmet, like a white chest, and stuff like that. Selkie, we said, was the daughter of Sea Spray and Alana. Stoker, which by the way is slang for a fireman, depending on what country you're from. We said his parents were Inferno and Firestar. And last but not least, we had Swift Shift, who was supposed to be the son of Blur and Greenlight. And interestingly enough, in this scene in the nightclub, when all these characters are around and everybody's interacting with each other in character, Tinker, who, by the way, played by my wife, she was built by Ratchet and Wheeljack, who were the same guys who built the Dinobots, right? So like Grimlock and stuff like that. So she referred to Grimlock as her big brother. And they also, Warhawk is talking with people about how he has all this aggression and he's frustrated that the war is over, right? And so one of the things that happens in that conversation is they mentioned that a lot of the former Decepticons who do have that inherent aggression are getting into um, this gladiator stuff that is actually kind of akin to like an MMA or like a old school wrestling like Hulk Hogan kind of a thing. You know what I mean? And so uh, another kind of Easter egg was we mentioned that there were kind of like you know how with boxing we talk about like the heavyweight champion of the world, right? So there's like heavyweight and then there's like lightweight or whatever. We actually used Hasbro's size classes for Transformers toys um, when we were referring to various people who were the champions for that kind of division, that weight class. So we mentioned that Grimlock is considered the champ, right? That most people see him as number one. And so Tinker, then, who obviously takes more after Ratchet and Wheeljack in terms of her design, she's like a white sports car. We actually said she had red and green decals on her, which is a nod to Wheeljack, but they were medical oriented, which is a nod to Ratchet. We specifically said her job was for organ transplants to get the organ there like as fast as possible. So that's why she's a sports car. Um, at any rate, so she's saying you could go wrestle my big brother, Grimlock. And so Warhawk was like, yeah, I absolutely want to fight Grimlock. Like, let's do that. I thought that was very interesting. Um, and then the other thing I thought was interesting was Warhawk ends up talking to Adamant quite a bit. And then Adamant is the quote unquote son of Ironhide, right? So he ends up taking Warhawk to meet his dad at a shooting range. And then Ironhide famously can retract his hand up into his forearm. And then he has this kind of like a chemical sprayer that can slide out where the hand was. And then Ironhide can shoot stuff at you that is very, very hot or very, very cold, or he can shoot acid, kind of seems like anything goes. And the way we handled that in DC Heroes was we just called it EV. We built it as a gadget. We just said, here's its EV. Um, but so Ironhide, has a gun then at one point and is shooting these targets that are slowly coming towards him. And we said it is sort of the silhouette of a generic seeker. And so Warhawk then is doing the same thing. And, so that's going on. And then while those guys are doing that, Hog Wild, we go back to him. He's the addict. He steals a ton of stuff from the hospital. And we based the cloning equipment on an episode of Transformers Animated, where Starscream was cloning himself and he was creating all the other seekers and stuff in that episode, including um, a female that sometimes gets referred to as his daughter, right? So at any rate, Hog Wild basically steals that same kind of gear and he takes it to Swindle. And when my son rolled the dice, he rolled like critical success. So we said he had quite the haul, right? Like he had really, really good equipment. So he gives that to Swindle. Swindle is very pleased. And then when they're talking back and forth, they're making a lot of kind of charisma checks and stuff like that, persuasion rolls. And my son kept getting these amazing rolls. So Swindle ends up telling him who his contact is, and it's a really obscure Decepticon named Sky Stalker. And Swindle says that Sky Stalker also needs power generators. And he tells Hog Wild that if you come across any, or if you find out that there are some that are not being very well guarded, let me know. And just giving me the information has value to me, and I will give you more nucleon. So Hog Wild agrees to that and says us Decepticons need to stick together. So I thought that was interesting too, because in our game world, we tried to get to this point where people had said Autobot and Decepticon are kind of like wartime terminology, and that after the war, they would refer to themselves as a former Autobot or a former Decepticon. So them speaking in the present tense to me was very telling, right? And then that brought us to the main plot. So months have passed now, and now we're caught up to like the modern day, right? And on Earth, a series of disasters strike. And for more information on that, because I can tell this is already going to be a long video, for more information on those disasters, just check out our recent videos. It's very well documented. But, anyways, so right now, New York City has a partial blackout, right? So, Optimus Prime, who is now, we said in previous videos, he's a member of a new organization on Earth that is being referred to as the Round Table. And so he addresses his fellow Cybertronians and he tells them that their neighbors on Earth are experiencing the sorts of natural disasters that happened when Cybertron was brought into Earth's orbit, which that happened all the way back in the 80s cartoon. Megatron did that, created tidal waves and earthquakes and all sorts of stuff. At any rate, the point is, so the people of Earth need all the help they can get. So Optimus tells engineers like Wheeljack to prepare several large cube-shaped energy generators that can be transported to Earth and taken to hospitals. Because according to Optimus Prime, their first priority should be to give the hospitals electricity, because there's people who were on life support and stuff like that when everything hit the fan and the light and the power failed, right? So they're trying to save lives, and so they're racing against the clock. So the Cybertronians find themselves breaking up into small teams, and one of those teams has a guy who looks like an all gold version of Optimus Prime, and his name is Victory Ursus, or Vic. And we've mentioned Vic in a bunch of old episodes, actually. So he transforms into a truck mode that, again, it looks just like Optimus Prime's 1980s, cab over engine, flat nose semi with a trailer with a ramp that goes down in the back. And Vic has his own version of roller, which is also gold. So, and we've never actually mentioned that before. So this is the first adventure where we mentioned his little drone guy. So he drives out of the trailer and stays on Cybertron. Warhawk played by Brad, picks up the huge cube-shaped generator and he slides it into the trailer, and it's kind of a tight fit, but that gives you an idea of about how big the generator is when it fills the entire back of a semi. And as he's doing this, Hog Wild sees all of this and he radios Swindle using, there's a thing on his forearm that flips up and there's like a TV screen there so they can talk to each other like Skype. And at any rate, so Hog Wild tells Swindle exactly where they are taking the generator, like their ETA, and how many characters are going to be guarding the thing, right? So Swindle, in turn, notifies Skystalker, who is this mystery Decepticon, basically, right? And Skystalker has, at this point in the timeline, used that cloning equipment to make copies of himself who serve as his new Vehicons. So he sends his Vehicons to the hospital just as the PCs get there to hook up the generator here to the local power grid. And when the Vehicons arrive, I thought this was also very interesting. Warhawk is like chomping at the bit to blast them, right? And he is asking, he's like, can I shoot him? Is it okay? Can I lay into these guys? But like his aggression, or his bloodlust, whatever you want to call it, is just like bubbling over. And so when the Viacons attack, he immediately opens fire, and he actually misses because the Viacons are kind of like a little bit smaller than him. They're faster, they're very agile. So he needs to roll kind of high to hit him. And he fails a roll. And of course, that bolt of energy doesn't just suddenly cease to exist when you fail to hit the target, right? It keeps traveling along its path. So a transformer level energy blast hits an apartment building and blows out a wall. And so then people inside scream and they, run away in terror, fleeing into the hallway and, stuff like that. And by the way, if the transformers start a fire, we mentioned, in recent games with all this stuff going wrong where there's no government anymore, that means there's no fire department anymore, right? Um, so this could be a really massive problem. The player characters could be starting like the Chicago Fire, that level of bad situation in New York City, right? Victory Ursus, by the way, he did the same thing. He took a shot and missed. He actually hit a vehicle parked off on the side of the street, and that exploded, so he's destroying somebody else's private property, when he does that. Tinker, who again is like the daughter of Wheeljack and Ratchet, basically, she's like trying to hook this generator up, and in the dark, by the way. And so she's having trouble like with compatibility issues, right? Where she's trying to take something Cybertronian and make it work with something from Earth. And so it takes a little finagling to make those two ideas work together. So she has to, in other words, make rolls to make that happen. And she's at this point not rolling high enough. So as she's frustrated with all this, she sees her teammates almost set an apartment building full of families on fire and destroy, vehicles on the street, causing explosions and so on and so forth, right? So she's telling them to be careful. And Hog Wild tries to talk the Vehicons down, and he says that a generator isn't worth dying for. But the Vehicons are a bit mindless, and they only care about getting their hands on the power source. So Warhawk retracts his right hand, and then what slides out in its place is a glowing purple spiked ball, right? And then he uses this melee weapon to bash his enemies because he's trying to not start fires, and so on and so forth, right? So we switched to kind of more melee stuff. And this process took a long while. Because like I said, the Viacons are sort of like smaller and faster and more agile and so on and so forth. So combat lasted for hours. But in the end, the player characters wrecked the Viacons. And actually, really, it was mostly Warhawk with some help from Vic. Um, I can't remember now if Hog Wild attacked. I actually think he was trying to convince his team not to attack Decepticons on sight. And and then that brings us to the epilogue. So once the generator is turned on and the hospital has power again, Pinker kind of does like a little victory dance and she's very pleased with herself. Um, Victory Ursus says they need to figure out how the Viacons knew they were bringing a generator here at this exact place at this exact time, right? And they don't yet know that it was Hog Wild who ratted them out. But then Hog Wild starts to say that it's not the Decepticons' fault. And he says they have to do this sort of thing in order to survive. And he suggests that the Viacons were just hungry and that the Autobots were willing to kill them for the crime of being poor and oppressed, right? So Hog Wild's like trying to play the victim card here. Victory Ursus says that's BS, that the Decepticons are welcome to go to Cybertron whenever they want. And these days, on Cybertron, there's plenty of Energon to drink, so on and so forth. But Hog Wild counters that if these guys go to Cybertron, they have to submit to quote unquote oppressive Autobot overlords. And so what seems to start to happen at the end of the game is it seems like the party wants to split down the middle with Victory Ursus and Tinker on the Autobot kind of end of the spectrum, right? While Hog Wild and Warhawk really seem more interested in teaming up and doing Decepticon things. And so that's where we ended it as far as the in-game stuff goes. But then out of game, we still sat around the table for at least an hour having this big discussion about, you know, what do we actually want the role of Decepticons to be in our game world moving forwards, right? And my son suggested rolling up a new character who would try to basically become the new Megatron and lead the Decepticons to glory again. And if I recall correctly, maybe I don't, I think Brad was kind of into that idea, of having like an all Decepticon group of player characters that does Decepticon things. And we haven't talked about this yet, and Brad listens to the podcast. So if you're listening to this, Brad, feel free to jump in and correct me or add to it or whatever needs said. But I think that different people play role-playing games for different reasons, right? So like for me, like anymore, I'm like always the GM and I basically never play. So I can't really talk about what I want out of gaming in a way where I'm at in life now, like from a player point of view, I mean. But like when I was young, for instance, when I was a teenager, I was very awkward and I wasn't married yet or anything and I was kind of like a lonely kid, right? So one of the things I did in role-playing games is I would always hit on female NPCs. And it was kind of like because things weren't going my way in real life, I kind of wanted some escapism where things were going good for my character that I was playing in the game. You know what I mean? I wanted that outlet for that. But that's not how everybody's head works, right? So a lot of people, I think, through the week, they pay their taxes, they go to work, they obey the speed limit, so on and so forth. And for them, when game day rolls around, they might want to play Dungeons and Dragons and be like a chaotic evil barbarian that just pillages everything in sight and kills people that look at him the wrong way and so on and so forth. You know what I mean? And so our gaming group probably needs to have a conversation along those lines to see, where's everybody at now? Because I also have noticed that sort of thing changes. Like I mentioned, what I was into when I was younger, after I was married and I would play games, I think that what I wanted was more comedy oriented, right? Because my situation in life had changed, then therefore what I wanted out of gaming had kind of changed too. So we haven't had one of those conversations for a while. We probably need to see where everybody's at with it, what they want out of the game. Um, and yeah, maybe we will have an all Decepticon party that just does bad stuff. Another thing that we had kind of talked about was Scorponok, because I mentioned in other episodes of my podcast that at the end of the war, Megatron and Galvatron coexisted, and that was a time travel thing. Like on the cartoon, Megatron becomes Galvatron. And then in the Marvel Comics run back in the day, they did a time travel thing where Galvatron goes back in time and ends up fighting Megatron, which I always liked that. I thought that was really cool. So we did something similar to that. The point is, I don't want to spend too long on it, but the point is just that they both existed by the time you got to the year 2025. So we said they had been working together and were defeated, but that the guy who was kind of, after you get rid of those two, the guy who had the most rank at that time was Scorponok. And Scorponok is a kind of character called a headmaster. That means that his head comes off and transforms into a smaller character. And in this case, that character's name is Zarek. And Zarek is actually not a robot. Zarek is this alien with green skin. He comes from a planet called Nebulos. And so for him to end the war and kind of sign the terms of surrender and stuff like that, that's left a lot of the Decepticons really unhappy. And we intentionally have done this because a lot of what we do with our Transformer stuff, we base it on something from history. And if you're familiar with the end of World War One, how Germany was really unhappy with the terms, right? When all was said and done, we intentionally were drawing on that idea, setting up the possibility that in the future there could be kind of a World War II. There could be some new Decepticon thing happen that would be maybe even worse than what we've seen before. But right now it's all up in the air. And so we're kind of having this conversation of, did we end one war just to start another war? Is that really what we want to do? Or do we want to kind of explore peacetime for a while because we always see these characters at war? And do we really just want to do more of what we already have? Or do we want to do something different? And do we want to explore these characters in a way we've never seen before? Right. Um, and I think personally, I'm kind of more into the second one. But again, we got to talk to people because, like, if what people want is just kind of like mindless carnage or something like that, then maybe that guy needs to play a Sharkticon or something. We'll figure it out, but that's sort of how game day ended this past weekend. This is the most recent game we've played as of me recording this. And yeah, we had a big talk. Personally, I felt like I had really high hopes going into this game session. I'm a huge Transformers fan. I've mentioned before, that's like my number one hobby is Transformers. So I really, really, really had high hopes that this was going to just be this incredibly awesome game. And it didn't meet my expectations. So me coming out of it at the end of the day, I was like, that didn't go as good as I'd hoped. Not real happy with that one. And I sent a message to everybody on Facebook and kind of said as much. But when they got back to me, they all said they loved it. So, their experience was not my experience with it. Um, so I don't know. And then we had the conversation. The talk was good. We're probably not done talking about it yet. Um, but we'll figure out where we're going, and yeah, we'll see what happens next. Um, I don't like to plan too far ahead because I feel like then I'm railroading my players. I'm really really into think of a thing that sounds good, run that thing. The players are going to kind of do something else anyways. You know what I mean? I mean that's just the nature of role playing games. And then when that happens, take a little time, step back, look at what they've done and say, "Okay, now given that that's the foundation we're building off of, where do we go from here?" So the ideas I had for where I was wanting to go is not quite what they did, and that's fine. More power to the players, but so so I need to kind of recalibrate on my end, and yeah, we'll see what happens. But yeah, that was it for this one. My players liked this one. Hopefully you guys liked hearing about it. If so, as always, we would love it if you took just a quick minute of your time to smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.